Welcome to It's About Time. This is where we challenge outdated higher education models and push for bold student-first reforms. Today, we're joined by Dr. Laurie Dodge, Vice President of Quality Assurance and Accreditation at CBEN, Competency-Based Education Network. As a leading voice in competency-based education and assessment, Dr. Dodge has been instrumental in developing frameworks that challenge traditional time-based metrics in higher education. Together, we'll explore how we can move beyond the century-old Carnegie unit to create more meaningful measures of student learning and achievement. Well, hi, Laurie. Thanks for joining us today. You've been around competency-based education for a long time, developed programs, overseen, addressed policy-related issues and accreditation issues. Can you briefly explain competency-based education approach and how it fundamentally differs from the traditional higher education model?
Well, thank you first, David, for having me here. I'd love to talk about competency-based education, but competency-based education focuses on the learning, validated learning. It unbundles, takes away the time constraint that we have in our credit hour programs and focuses on authentic assessment. So one of the things that probably is the keystone in competency-based education is the idea that learning is fixed and time is varied. So let's just pretend here that we're jumping into a credit hour course. And in that course, we start in August and we end in December. Now, if all of us were in the same class, some of us in December may have an A, some may have a B, some may have a C. In competency-based, now let's jump into a competency. We can work at our own pace. So David, this might be an area that you have experience. You can go through quicker. You're going to get done, in 4 weeks. For me, it may take a little bit longer. I'm going to get done in 8 weeks, but we can't go out the door, so to speak, until we have mastered that competency. So the learning is fixed. And I think that's a key aspect of competency-based education.
Thank you. We've both been doing this for quite some time, talking about student-focused, competency-based approaches. What kind of resistance do we encounter in higher education around moving in this direction? And what do you think drives that resistance?
David, I think the resistance, and I like to call it hesitant curiosity, because I think it's just change. It could be competency-based education, could be something else, but it pushes on the way we've been doing things in higher education for a long time. So that as a faculty member, I may be used to setting up a syllabus. We're going to do this in week 1, week 2, week 3. And CBE, I now have to meet the student where they are. So that's a change. It changes also systems. How do you do financial aid? How do you run the program? What things do you have to do that's different in regards to your learning management system or your student information system? So I think it's change. And that's where, and folks may think, I'm doing okay the way it is. I don't need to change right now. So I think that's where the hesitancy comes. And I think that in competency-based education, we need to do a better job communicating what it is to all.
I think you're right. And, there's also this other element of time. Time we understand so well. We've been doing a time-based approach for so long. And the other aspect, I think, is time is easy to measure. We can measure time. So the measurement aspects on the outcome side, I assume there's more pressure in a competency-based model to make sure that the assessments are authentic, are relevant, and you can support if you're not dependent upon a base of time. Can you talk to us a bit about that and how we get to these kind of understandings of high-quality outcomes and assessments?
Yeah. So in competency-based education, as you said, David, we focus on authentic assessment. And what we mean by authentic performance-based assessment is when that learner completes their program, you want those assessments to be what they would do in the workplace or in the discipline. And they are validating that learning through their program. The rigor of those assessments is high and the quality is high because you do have your employers or disciplinary folks co-creating that with the faculty. What does the assessment look? They're also validating that learning to say, yes, this is exactly what's needed when that learner completes their program. And they may tell faculty too, when we're around the table, look, you think this is really important, but that's not anymore. That's not what we're looking for. So I think it's that co-creation, opening the door to building those programs and building those strong assessments.
And when you do that, is there a necessity then to be more closely aligned with workforce needs and employers? Does this push us into or allow us the opportunity to spend more time making sure that these authentic assessments and outcomes are really workforce related?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The co-creation, working with employers to make sure you have it right, but it's necessary. You know, in the world that we're in right now, employers are saying, look, yes, you're sending us graduates, but they're not ready for work. There's skills gaps. We also have, for adult learners that are already working, need to skill up because their job keeps changing. So I think that flexibility and competency-based education to meet what employers are asking for, those skills-based, we need to have them around the table with us.
Well, that's great. Let's talk about sequence. We talk about unbundling courses, traditional courses, so you get to a competency level. And once you do that, there appears to be more flexibility in how you sequence those competencies, especially if they're delivered in a more modular kind of format. And is that playing a role in the appetite, that a growing appetite for more competency-based approaches, especially as you're talking about students who are interested in workforce advancement?
Yes. The kind of the sequencing and the bundling of the competencies is a result of backward design. So let's just start, when you're building competency-based education, higher education is politely stolen the idea of backward design from K-12. So backward design is when you think about, you build your competencies first, those outcome statements, then look at your evidence, your assessment, and then the learning journeys. So because of this pedagogical approach to building, that bundling of those competencies, you may be going through two competencies at the same time because they're integrated and that's how it was built. Or you may have a whole menu of competencies and certain workplace or employers say, look, these are the 3 things that I need to upskill my folks. So I want them to come into these 3 competencies. So I think it allows a larger menu that is workforce relevant.
Great. Let's talk a bit about grain size. So when we think about degrees and courses that lead into degrees and the development of those courses, I mean, we think in terms of credit hours that are Carnegie-based unit-based, time-based credit hours. As you get to smaller grain sizes and the ability to credential, micro-credentials or alternative credentials that may be smaller than a credit hour, how does that drive the way we think about where competency-based education may be most relevant in traditional higher education, but also in credentials that, may not immediately stack into a degree?
Yeah. So there is a lot of movement, as you know, David, in those smaller units of learning, certificates. I think a study just came out that showed even those younger than 25 more are going for certificate programs that are aligned to particular jobs. And so I think competency-based education, because of the flexibility, can build these certificate programs that are work relevant. Now, the push is that some institutions don't have the policies and the flexibility yet to address what this looks like. So sometimes it occurs in our what we call our CTE or our areas where it's maybe not credit bearing because it's kind of a safer place to start. But what we're seeing, I've been working a lot with the California community colleges, and they are building their competencies to be credit bearing, even though it's a certificate program. So I think we're seeing that bridge that because David, we don't have this currency called learning yet, right? We're tethered to the credit hour, even in competency-based education. So because of that, we want to make sure that learners, even in certificate programs, have that money in the bank, that credit, if they want to stack them for degree programs or continue throughout life.
So as we think about barriers, what role do accreditors play and the Department of Education play in perpetuating time-based models? And how do we get to address some of the regulatory challenges? You talk about universities not having policies and practices. I mean, some of that is driven by regulatory demands, some of it not, some of it just preference. But how has he been thinking about that, and how do you think about that?
No, it's a great question. And I think the two big players are your institutional accreditors and your specialized accreditors and professional accreditors. So institutional accreditors have processes in place through substantive change for approval of competency-based education, both types, the credit hour, kind of the behind the scenes, and the direct assessment, which is for the federal government, for Department of Ed. So that's kind of the start of that approval. I do think that accreditors are looking at focusing on outcomes and not just always, well, how many credits is that worth? And is that equivalent? So I think that conversation is definitely there. We've also seen, CBEN's been working with nursing, the field of nursing has a perfect framework for competency-based, and they're going to all competencies, as well as teacher education and the idea of apprenticeships, which line up really well with competency-based education. So I think the doors are opening. The last thing I want to say, David, that I know at least 2 institutional accreditors are now approving 90 credit baccalaureate degrees, though 3-year, though we all know Europe's been doing this for decades. But I do think it's starting to shift with a focus on learning, not time.
That's great. And that time to completion is one of the motivating factors, especially for those who can move faster than those that are artificially put on an assembly line. And I think that's a fantastic opportunity for us. So if you put on your crystal ball and look ahead, what do you see happening over the next 5 or 10 years in education? And or what do you aspire to in terms of adoption of competency-based education and the future? And what makes you either optimistic or not about the increased use and presence and positive outcomes associated with competency-based education?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the future, and we're seeing it trend up now, is the growth of competency-based education programs, and that's in all disciplines. So we're seeing it at community colleges, we're seeing it at research institutions, and I think part of the push is the question out there on return on investment that our prospective learners are asking. Look, if I go through this program, what doors will that open? What will that look like? And what kind of debt will I carry? Allowing learners to go through quicker will reduce that debt. And the alignment of that program in the workforce also, they can see that the doors are open. So I do see movement. The residual effect that I'm seeing in some of the colleges now is as institutions are building CBE programs, now they're looking at their credit hour programs and thinking, we need to improve this. We need to bring more innovative teaching. We need to think about our pedagogical approach. And do learners have to do something 5 times if they can show us that they can master it once? So I'm hoping those residual effects, too, will also push on just how we do teaching and learning in higher ed.
And you bring up one important point there, is that there's an impact or an influence on the delivery model. on the pedagogy or the andragogy. If you are moving at any pace, your support teams, including your instructional support and faculty, have to be flexible on that scheduling, or you have to think about asynchronous models that are not dependent upon fixed scheduling. So, how do you think about that? And is that a major part of our transition to getting our head around the full potential of competency-based education?
Yeah, I think, David, that's right. We need to have the systems to be flexible to address learner needs. And so if we have systems, our student information systems and our learning management systems that are kind of like big ships that need to turn and be flexible, how do we make that happen? Some of the best strategies for that is when institutions or colleges are building CBE programs, bring your whole team around the table as you're building. Bring your IT folks and your financial aid folks and business folks to talk about, how can this be done? I think the more programs that are in the institutions push on these systems to start to address and change, because this is not something that's going away. It's here to stay.
So most parts of education have not been able to can avoid conversations around AI, artificial intelligence, and the ability to actually deliver some support, both instructional and non-instructional support for students, better on demand than we have in the past. That has to influence the work in competency-based space, and certainly with CBIN. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it really hits a couple of different places. One, AI is being used to help. I see it as a thinking partner when you're building competencies. So CBAN at our last conference had a whole wide approach to how do you use AI in helping you build competencies. So we're seeing it at the creation part. The other part that we're seeing is as a teaching assistant. So as a generative AI that's using content from faculty and feeding that, but learning along the way. So if a learner asks a question, it can be answered. And so I think that's the part where the accreditors and other policies, so what does it look like when we have robot plus human assisting learners through their learning journey? So it is the future. I'd say more than the future, it's here now.
It's here now. Yeah,
it's here now.
Yeah, it's ubiquitous. It's unavoidable and ubiquitous, and how we incorporate it, I think, is critically important. Well, that's it for today. But the conversation doesn't stop here. If we want real change in higher education, we have to rethink the way we measure success. Share this episode and stay tuned for more bold ideas and candid conversations on It's About Time.